think we all feel like Richard. And I don't know whether to apologise or to just go on blithely and enjoy the experience. I do want to also acknowledge those who have organised this event and who called me up late last year and said, we're doing it, would you want to be a part of it? And it took me a few weeks to work out what they were talking about. I feel so far distant from this context, and I'm grateful to be a part of this. And more than that, I'm interested in what happens in the future, and what happens from today and this weekend on. Often there is a generation of energy and excitement in the first iteration of these things. The next hurdle is the space between now and next year. And that's a particularly difficult path to cross, and it's got to be crossed if this kind of discourse is to continue. And I hope that I can be a part of that. I hope that I can put some energy into it too. So let's begin. Throughout President Kimball's two essays, there are two principal rhetorical ideas. First, that a noble spiritual teacher or artist, or scientist, or inventor, or doctor, etc., who lives by faith, dependent upon the Spirit, and whose professional practice is authentically consistent with spiritual practice, will have a substantial advantage in achieving her or his field, success in her or his field, when compared with those whose lives are otherwise. The second idea is somewhat related, that a point will be reached, perhaps in the artist's aptitude, and in the process of time when the expressions of such people will be influential among audiences that are much wider than the church community, perhaps the global community of peers, receivers and critics. In speaking to educators in the first essay and artists in the second, the bold declaration is that it is not a matter of waiting for the context to change so that our work will be appropriately received. It is a matter of focusing our efforts in such a way that the context, as it is, will both receive it and respect it. Now I want to briefly explore two significant sea changes that have occurred in the last 200 years in the progress of Western society, the effects of which have produced, I think, surprisingly fertile opportunities for artists who want to make a difference in society now. Society's forward progress is naturally dynamic and is steadily changing as it goes, but there are times when this condition accelerates and deepens dramatically, and it seems that society's apparently stable axis shifts substantially, and life changes forever. To clarify the kinds of changes taking place in each of these sea changes, I will use a few examples of works of art that demonstrate the fundamental conditions underlying the changes, while focused almost wholly on what the work tells us about the role of the artist in society and the social conditions that give context to that performance. It's a ridiculous project in 25 minutes, and I admit to speaking in gross generalities. This will end up probably a cartoon more than anything substantially theoretical. But the substance, I believe, is accurate. I'm going to give you, well, at least remind you, I think you know a lot of this stuff, an art history lesson. And I want to begin with the wrong direction. Okay, so this is John Constable, British painter. The title of the painting is called The Lock. It was painted in 1824. Our eyes go to the man in the painting's centre who is operating the lock. The painting revolves around him. The tree in the background leans in the same direction that he leans. The rope tying the boat in front of the tree points to him. The clouds on the far left swirl back around to the tree on the right, framing the locksman. And against the probability that someone of his social station and engaged in this kind of lowly activity would rarely bathe and would even more rarely wash clothes, he is wearing clothes of the highest tone and brightest hue in order to attract our attention. An axiom occurs here, that everything that is seen is intended to be there. Hence it is clear that we are supposed to focus on the locksman. The power of the work's discourse rests with this person. This is a common person, involved in common activities in the highly class-conscious British society of the 19th century. Why is this the subject of the painting? Why not the vast, majestic landscape, the grand, heroic battle scene, or the aristocratic family portrait? At the same time, the painting's tone is one of vitality, contentment, and peace. This is a work that speaks of the nobility of the activities of common people. It seems to suggest that this locksman and his place in the broader social structure is as valued as any landed gentry, nobleman, or prince. To understand this discourse, we must look at the fundamental changes that were occurring in society and in art practice at the time. The Western world's kingdoms and principalities had progressed to such an extent that a monarch or a prince or an aristocratic landowner could not hold government of their domain alone. Representation of the lower classes was essential to establish the conditions that would enable the monarch's self-sustaining machine to continue to advance in a manner that would satisfy her or his ambitions and keep society stable and balanced. The feudal system was fading away quickly. Levels of representation and decision-making steadily increased to the point where the balance of power flipped over and the monarch's previously preeminent powers weakened against the capacity of the lower classes to determine society's destiny. In these conditions, the concept of nation was born, and with it, the idea of a public. A condition that accompanied these births was that the discipline of the masses was no longer at the whim and fancy of the monarch and his advisors. The responsibility for discipline and its systems also shifted to the public. Hence, a fundamental objective of this new society was the production of the moral, self-governing citizen. Indeed, the production of this condition occupied minds and governments at the highest level, and the newly invented purpose-built art museum was a primary tool in the system of its production. Along with government being transferred to the populace, the role of artists shifted dramatically. The artist heretofore had been regarded as a craftsman. The artist was commissioned by the monarch, the church, or the aristocracy to create works, the discourses of which were to elevate the commissioner in the social power structures of the time. The portraits and family groupings were to demonstrate wealth and social bearing. The grand exotic landscapes and battle scenes were to demonstrate the commissioner's capacity to overcome the enemy and traverse and control the world. The portraits of other important people were to demonstrate important social alliances, or perhaps dominance. Artists, while applying style and perhaps some forms of subversive imagery, were really at the mercy of the commissioner. But with the shift of government to the populace, artists were freed from these shackles and chose subject matter of their own liking, and in response to a new market. With the artist's status being that of a commoner, the artist for subject matter naturally focused on commoners and the integrity and value of commoners' lives. This condition was shortly preceded by a shift in the definition of art and its new relationship with aesthetics. As a craftsperson, the artist's work was valued on its capacity to meet the purposes of the commissioner, not unlike today's kitchen cabinet maker. But increasingly, as the concept of the moral, self-governing citizen emerged, and interest was given to those human conditions that might generate elevated feelings and behaviour among the masses, exposure to and appreciation of beauty was thought to have significant influence on one's comportment, one's inner grace and bearing. Aesthetics had been advancing over centuries, and now, since artworks were newly seen to have the capacity to convey beauty, which in turn increased a person's comportment, aesthetics began to be linked to visual art for the first time in history. The term art, which was defined as craft, began to appear commonly with the epithet beautiful, as in de schöne Kunst, or la belle arti, or les beaux arts. Art and beauty were tied. The epithet was eventually dropped, art emerged with the aesthetic discourse, and artists became agents of moral improvement. Returning to Constable's painting of the Lock, this is a radical contemporary work possessing a highly influential discourse, provocative and relevant to the time. It is no wonder that when it last sold 2 years ago, it went to auction with an estimated 2 million Great British pounds and sold for 9.1 million Great British pounds. It's easy to see how the birth of the nation, with the necessity therefore of the moral self-governing citizen, the shift in the social status of artists giving them the ability to focus on subjects of their choice, and the application of aesthetics to visual art by the impact of the subjects that artists were newly drawn to are all fundamentally related and intercausal. These are only some of the evidences of the sweeping sea change that occurred in Western society at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries. Some regard these changes as evidence of the beginning of modernism. Others point to earlier signs. It is important to remember that all of these conditions occurred within a continuously evolving context, and they weren't going to stand still at that point either. I'm going to jump now to the next sea change. It occurred in the middle of the 20th century and began in this country, the USA. Once the common classes had obtained the balance of social power, the right of representation was quickly given to the bourgeois sectors of society, the intellectuals and businessmen, those with the most influence. Indeed, it was the bourgeois that had effected the change in power in the first place. But the utopian ideal upon which representative government functioned was that the people governed. You know, Abraham Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, for the people. The longer the bourgeois represented the people in government, the more secure they became and the fewer the voices they truly represented. The number of disenfranchised sectors of society was steadily growing. This is no better represented than in American real estate or automobile advertisements in 1950s magazines. Yeah, there they are. The white family with 2 children and a dog in the front yard of a white painted suburban home with a shiny white vehicle in the driveway, all surrounded by a white fence. One of the distinguishing features of this kind of modernity through its 130-year history is increasingly reductive approach to all things. Science became the model. On the one hand, it gave rise to larger numbers of specializations that enabled great discoveries in various disciplines and major problems solved. On the other hand, it created mainstreams and dominant theories and practices, which in turn produced disenfranchised sectors. Similar situations had developed in many social practices, including the visual arts. Painting dominated, the visual arts were broken apart, and competition developed between the art forms, with many being disenfranchised. In accordance with scientific practice, each art form increasingly focused on itself and its area of competence. The painter's superiority in society was claimed by knowledge of and adeptness with paint and its capacities. Hence, the work steadily withdrew from being concerned with representation of the world and more upon the properties and opportunities, the internal relations that painting possessed. Painting subsequently became increasingly abstract. It's important to note that abstraction was a consequence, not an objective. The quest to seek the irreducible essence in painting, its most pure state, because in its purity one would find its power and significance. This was a utopian reductive project. The rhetoric suggested that if painting, and anything else for that matter, were to find its most pure form, perfection had been achieved and the painter would hereafter reside in this condition. One prominent theorist eventually declared that flatness was the characteristic that painting shared with no other art form and was painting's irreducible essence. But if painting was to make no reference to anything beyond itself, it could not ask anything of the viewer. In other words, if it wasn't about something, then in principle there was nothing to be learned from it. Indeed, the expectation was that the viewer's eyes were disconnected from the brain, and one would simply revel in the work's visuality. It was a purely optical experience without meaning. At the same time, the work made no reference to anything beyond itself. If it carried no meaning, and thus it could not be compared with any other painting, how would one determine quality, which to a large degree is a comparative process? The answer is in the nature of the aesthetic experience that one receives from the work. But clearly the aesthetic response to these works was different to the kind of aesthetic response one would obtain from John Constable's The Lock. No longer is the viewer learning about the dignity and value of everyday work and productivity. No longer is the viewer asked to absorb those kinds of socially noble ideas and hence increasing comportment. The kind of aesthetic response that was to be obtained from these abstract works had also been reduced to an inexpressible quality that is revealed by the elated cry, "Hey man, it works." So the late modernist work is abstract, esoteric, superficial, psychological, and ineffable. Against the backdrop of hegemonic systems of social control being imposed upon the rising number of disenfranchised sectors. Firstly, the blacks in the southern United States developed unique and powerful strategies of civil disobedience, and they began to resist bourgeois expectations of social performance placed upon them. Thereafter, students from some key universities who travelled to the southern states to learn these methods mobilised their peers and also resisted expectations placed upon them. Thereafter, waves of resistance developed. Gays and lesbians, prisoners, and so on came to the table to declare that the governmental representation did not include them, and against the utopian ideology of nationhood, government of the people, by the people, for the people, the dominant white bourgeois representatives had no ideological legs to stand on, and the structures underpinning governmental practice began to fall apart, hence the term political correctness. The centre could not hold, and so it was with art. Of course, once a manifesto is declared, once the utopian ideal is seen to be achieved, the movement is closed and the only space to go is elsewhere. The mainstream had become so narrow that the space beyond was vast. The ideological purity of the modernist project was polluted by the egos and wealth of its primary protagonists, and everything about modernist paintings, the works, the artists, their styles, their wealth, and institutional acceptance was seen to be enclosed within that confined, self-focused modernist space. So the new work reacted to every one of these factors and did not look like anything that came before. Instead of the work carrying the mark of the artist, the sign of status and wealth, it was industrially produced. Instead of it being filled with complex internal relations, it was simple and relied heavily upon its context. Instead of it possessing an ineffable transcendental aesthetic, it rejected aesthetics completely. In fact, some called it anti-aesthetic. As Robert Morris declared, the better new work takes relationships out of the work and makes them a function of space, light, and the viewer's field of vision. Minimalism's primary project was to dismantle modernist theory. Hot on the heels of minimalist theory, another quick, it's showing okay. Another quick attack on modernist art occurred, and in theoretical terms, conceptual art completed the task that minimalism began. It has been said that the modernist path was a continual reductive procession. Minimalism and conceptual art continued that reductive process. Minimalism eliminated the aesthetic in the hand of the artist, and conceptual art took away the object. In this work, by Art and Language, the thing in front of our eyes presents an incomplete map. It contains the American states of Iowa and Kentucky. One state's scale is true to the others, and the relationship to each other on the page is accurate according to that scale and their relative positions. With these as givens, the rectangular line surrounding the two states can be read as an actual line on the Earth's surface, with coordinates able to be identified accurately for each corner. The title of the work is Map to Not Indicate. At the bottom of the diagram is a list of geographic and geopolitical features that are contained within the drawn rectangle but not represented in the drawn map. Our minds quickly act to fill in the spaces. Our imagination sees the map forming and completing. The thing in front of our eyes then is a catalyst, a trigger for the creation of the actual work in our minds. Hence, the work of art no longer exists in physical space, but is a construction of the mind. In reacting to the modernist project with such power and economy, the minimalists gave permission for the mind and the eye to be reconnected, and in so doing, they also admitted that everything within the viewer's field of vision influences the viewer's response to the work and the work's meaning. In other words, the eye, the mind, and the context in which one stands are all fundamentally interconnected and inter-influential. And conceptual art enshrined those principles in a deeply intellectual and potentially meaningful way. The axiom that emerges from this framework is that the work's concept, its discourse, is paramount. All other strategies function to effectuate the discourse. So this was the 1960s, and we began by declaring that social change is ongoing. Like language, it keeps evolving, but there hasn't been another sea change since that time, and the fundamental principles established then remain largely intact. What has changed, however, is the extent to which those principles are explored and applied. if concept, discourse, is paramount. And if the work's intention is to convey meaning, to provoke inquiry, and to challenge assumptions about a particular important issue, then every tool and material is open to be applied to that end. Thus, every medium, method, arrangement, emotion, strategy, etc., is utilised in the exploration of the discourse. The artist is researcher, communicator, provocateur, and politician. The artist, via the work, asks important questions, challenges conventions and assumptions, speculates on alternative models and behaviours, proposes principles and scenarios, and otherwise rethinks and reimagines the world. And this list that I have up on the screen there is, in the first place, a definition of, well, the performance of the artwork, and then below that is how these works function in society now, the work, the artist, the viewer, and the outcomes. And I think it's worth just reading that last one. The work of art is a catalyst for inquiry and discussion about important issues. It's a tool to challenge assumptions and stimulate individual and social change. The artist is a researcher and a communicator, a provocateur, an educator. The viewer is a moral agent who is the work's principal subject. The outcomes are knowledge, empathy, and ethical sensitivity. That's contemporary art. Now, I'm going to, from here on in, I've just got a page to go, just scroll quickly through a number of images that are works from our museum's collection that I believe carry in very profound and it's very significant discourses that are quite influential. I'm doing this not to show you our great collection because there's such a small amount up here, but to show you the diversity. That this is not a streamlined new manifesto. It's actually a broad space that is not like the modernist trajectory in any way at all. Of course, some discourses are hotter than others, but all seriously considered and carefully articulated discourses are possible. The key then is based in principles of communication. In order to communicate effectively, it is important to understand to whom one is communicating. Who is the audience to be reached? What are that audience's concerns, doubts, wonders, fears, aspirations? What associations and metaphors are relevant to that audience? What conventions held by that audience need challenging? What insecurities exist that I need to negotiate? Good communication always apprehends and considers carefully the receiver to whom the communication is directed and aims to articulate effectively. At its heart is good listening and good observation. By far the majority of contemporary artists that I know desire for a better world. They are people who are not prepared to merely watch, but focus their thoughts and actions so that others can see. It is their form of taking a stand, and each one is deeply committed to it. These principles appear to me to provide a rich context for the realisation of President Kimball's vision for Mormon artists and for the positive effect that Mormon artists might have upon the world. The causes that we represent are the most profound and earth-changing that exist. They go to the centre of existence for every human being. Theoretically speaking, I know of no other people that could know the human conditions and its possibilities better. I know of no other people who might have a broader perspective of the bitter and the sweet, the conundrums, the paradoxes and the doubts, as well as the stable and grounded nature of faith and the evidences of a bright future. I know of no other people that should understand allegory, metaphor, and principle more completely and creatively, and hence has the potential to interrogate, provoke, and challenge more profoundly. And I believe that a noble spiritual teacher or artist or scientist or inventor or doctor, etc., who lives by faith dependent upon the Spirit and whose professional practice is authentically consistent with spiritual practice will have a substantial advantage in achieving success in their field when compared with those whose lives are otherwise, if they apply their thoughts, research and practice intelligently and openly enough.